Hello and welcome to Why Button, the podcast that asks why we care about video games. I'm your host, Kyle Starr. On this show, I interview creators, enthusiasts, journalists, and media personalities about their origins with video games, what keeps them so interested in the medium, even when they're not playing, and what excites them about the future. On this episode, I'm joined by former Vox Media journalist and editor, Alanna Okun. Very recently, Alanna made the brave decision to step away from her career of over a decade in journalism to pursue an education in creative technology. What prompted this change? While the love of tactile crafting provided her with the creative confidence, it was the medium of video games that opened Alanna up to a new creative outlet and led to this pivot in her professional journey. As someone who's equally fascinated by career journeys as I am video games, I just had to speak with Alanna about this change. It was a fulfilling conversation that really showcased the power of video games, not only as a fascinating and entertaining technology, but as a unique method to communicate one's own ideas. A mode of communication where art and interaction can complement the written word. Okay, how are you doing?
Good.
First and foremost, I guess thank you for doing this too.
Thank you so much for having me, and apologies again for getting the time wrong. We got back from the UK like 36 hours ago now, and my partner immediately adjusted to the schedule, and I have just been all over the place. I slept from 6 a.m. to 11 a.m. today.
Oh my God.
It's fine. I have a week until school officially starts, so I have time to kind of correct myself.
Got it. Yeah. You'll get back there in a couple of days. I wanted to actually touch on your travels and all of that. I should just jump into it and just introduce you. Hey, Alanna, thank you for joining me on Why Button. We're here to talk about video games at some point, but as dear listener, as you just heard, that Alanna's recovering from some jet lag. Tell me about your trip, your travels. I need to get into the why, but I want to know. I've been following you through Instagram. I know what's going on a bit, but I'm curious how it was.
No, it was a wonderful trip. So it was all around the UK, mostly Scotland, a little bit of England, London, where my partner and I, or he has a big job where he can only take so much time off, and he has to request it far in advance. So we'd known that we had to fill these specific 2 weeks of August, 6 months ago, and I've sort of been trying to retrofit ever since, figuring out okay, where wouldn't be crazy expensive to travel, where would the weather be remotely temperate, which sort of ruled out a lot of different places in August. And we landed on, this sort of itinerary where we went to a few highlights were the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, which if you don't know what that is, it's really cool. It's this I think it's certainly changed over time, but it's this essentially experimental theater festival where I think it's something there's 3,000 shows playing over the month of August in Edinburgh. And I will say the city gets really overrun. It's my partner compared it to going to Austin during South by Southwest, as a point of comparison. But we were meeting up with some friends who had done the festival before. It was our first time. So they sort of showed us their spreadsheet and how they planned out everything. And it was honestly really moving and cool to get to see so much new art. And look, a lot of what we saw was stand-up comedy, kind of straightforward, one-man shows, hour-long tops. But a lot of what people were attempting formally was so interesting. There was so much vulnerability, but also experimentation. We saw this play at 10:30 in the morning, which is probably the earliest I'll ever see a play in my life, that had no set whatsoever. The audience was sort of asked to imagine and conjure this world. And I was just completely transported by it, in a way that I actually think does tie into my experience of games and sort of interactive, media and experiences. So that was one leg of the journey. Another leg of the journey, we went to the Isle of Skye, which is just this absolutely stunning part of Scotland. I'm lucky that my partner grew up in London, which is why, we ended the trip there, and he can drive on the opposite side of the road. Otherwise, that leg of the journey would not have been possible. But that was sort of the majesty of nature, going to castles that were built in 1200. And so that was really cool to sort of get that sense of perspective. It's not the type of trip I generally take. I'm often sort of a city person. So overall, it was just really, really nice to get to spend this time together and to sort of get to have this different register of experiences. It certainly made the 2 weeks feel even longer than 2 weeks in a good way, where it's oh my God, we've got so many different little zones to go to. So I'm still recovering from that though.
No, indeed. That's a lot to come, any 2 week, time zone shift is going to be wild. And especially an experience like that, where between jobs or work as well. Like you have this sort of freedom and this opportunity to escape, and you're truly escaping in a kind of unknown land world and watching all these, this art take place, which is really, really cool. I'm a whiskey drinker. Did you have any scotch? Was there any scotch tasting going on?
So not as such. You had the option to sign up for the 3-hour whiskey tour. I don't really drink too much, and my partner and I sort of ended up doing more cocktail bars than anything else. But no, we definitely knew we were in peat country.
Yeah, the land of.
Yeah, the thing I sort of ended up indexing toward was it's also very yarn heavy. I'm a big knitter, crocheter, a lot of textile stuff. Oh my God, there are so many owner-led yarn stores that are just next door to a sheep farm. So me and my partner were laughing that it was he's got the whiskey, I've got the yarn. This is about as gender essentialist as we're ever gonna get.
Sure. That's amazing with the yarn. They're getting it right from the source, right? You're spinning it right from the source. That's amazing. Well, to dive into things, I wanted you on the show because I know that you have an affinity for games, but more importantly, you are in the midst of a pretty, I think, rather dramatic career shift, life change, moving away from your former life as an editor at Vox Media, taking the opportunity to step away from that and explore this new side of you. And so I guess to kick things off, I'm curious, why don't you explain exactly what's going on? I know you've written a piece about it to kind of explain to people this part of your life, but if you wouldn't mind kind of reiterating right now, what's up? What's going on?
Yeah, absolutely. It feels fun, actually, after so many years to have an answer to what's going on that's not the same as it ever was. So yeah, I was a journalist for the last 12 years. I started working at BuzzFeed right out of undergrad. It was 2012. So it was sort of this particular inflection point, I think, sort of in digital media. And then, I worked straight up until May of this year at Vox Media. And I really honestly enjoyed my career a great deal in that respect. It wasn't something that I think I was ever I need to do journalism or nothing. I think it was a little more, hey, I love reading. I love writing. I love sort of using words to communicate. I love the sort of social aspect of putting all of this together. It was sort of the career that felt right for me, particularly right out of college. And then, it's not to say that you blink and 12 years have passed, but I think there really were several moments where I kind of came up against, is this all there is? Or is this certainly all that I can learn, at this point in my career, at this point in my life? I think I got to a point where I was managing a lot more than I was maybe even doing some of the more creative work, which, I think is something that happens in really any sort of career path.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. It's interesting even talking to friends who are in games, in, tech, in sort of these other industries. And there's only so many problems that you can have essentially. But I think all of that is to say I was working at these publications at the same time as I was also doing some of my own writing. And so I wrote 2 books, both of which are sort of one very nominally and one very directly related to crafting. One is a memoir basically about, it's called The Curse of the Boyfriend Sweater, Essays on Crafting, and sort of about how making things physically by hand has been sort of this lifeline throughout my life. It's really helped me metabolize, grief and anxiety and joy and boredom and all those things. And then sort of on the steam of that, I wound up writing a much more straightforward intro knitting book, which is called How to Knit a Hat, which I really love. It's very straightforward, very philosophical in some ways. And that was such a fun project because it was really sort of my first experimentation in what I'll call direct service, right? Sort of how to put something together in this step-by-step way to, convey information to someone else. And that is something that I really took into my work life as well, and am now trying to take now. So all of that is to say that about 2.5 years ago, actually, no, I guess it's almost exactly 2 years ago. It was probably around this time 2 years ago. I realized I wanted to apply that same principle of making things, of, how does this work? How is a sweater made from 2 sticks and a piece of string? I really wanted to apply that to games because I had been someone who just absolutely loved video games my entire life. I got my first, I think I got the Game Boy Color when I was 8 years old, 1998, and sort of up through there. But I'd never really been someone who had any kind of, technical background or, I thought acumen. In fact, I think I'd always sort of said, hey, you're a words person, right? You were an English major in college. You chose this career path right after, like, you've really sort of thrown your lot in with the words. And again, I absolutely love and have deep respect for words. I think they're always going to be my atomic unit, but I think part of my, chafing perhaps in my career and in my sort of personal creative life had to do with feeling like maybe I wanted something that was a little more oblique or a little sort of more interactive, say, than words, or could provide maybe a little less rigid, maybe, of a framework. So all of this is to say, about 2 years ago, I sat down and decided to teach myself how to make a video game. Like, I don't know, it was sort of a funny, like, I spent the first 6 months teaching myself how to learn, essentially. Like, I had not learned a new skill like this, certainly in, the past dozen years. I had never really done anything that required such precision. Like, for all that I think knitting and fiber crafts are actually a really interesting onboard to, programming, that there's a lot in common. There's a lot of sort of input and output stuff going on in your brain with both. I think something I've always loved about handcrafts is that you can sort of get away with some, a little bit of messiness, a little bit of like, gonna slam this together and see what works. And I think programming, which can be very, black and white, very yes or no, very, you have a comma out of place, the whole thing doesn't work. I really kind of had to like take myself through that frustration and sort of allow myself to get better and to, just make a bunch of stuff and put it out into the world. And so that's what I was doing just solely as a hobby for probably a year or so. Sure. And then I started talking to a lot of friends, people who, saw what I was doing, saw that I was maybe, getting a little out of sorts at my current job, and were sort of like starting to encourage me to take it more seriously than just a hobby. And pretty quickly, what that sort of materialized for me was a number of graduate programs that are essentially like creative technology. Like, pretty quickly, I realized I did not want to go to grad school to make video games. In fact, like, a lot of, I think, my experimentation over the last couple of years has been more with the idea of games as a medium than games as a career necessarily. Like, I think something that I really latched onto was, how do I use a game to tell a story, which to me is a very different set of concerns than what is this technical skill I'm picking up and how would I apply it later on? So I wanted to sort of cast a net a little more widely. I had a number of friends who had come through a couple programs like this, including the one that, spoiler alert, I ended up at, which is called ITP at NYU. And that stands for, oh my God, I always get it wrong because it was made in like the 70s and has like
we'll fact check it. Give it your best shot.
It's the Interactive Telecommunications Program. Like, because it literally, I think it was founded in like 1977 when like that technology was like a VCR and like a phone line. And so there are a lot of people who come through this program and sort of its peer programs and do things in games, do things in interaction design. Other people will do things that are a lot more sort of like generally techie or generally artsy. I could even see myself like circling back around to journalism with sort of this like data set now. I think a big thing that I'm going to want to focus on is making these little pieces of software and kind of figuring out where the holes in my knowledge are that, my autodidactic self couldn't pick up on. So basically I applied to these programs, last February, I suppose. And I got into this one and I'm going in the fall, and I left my job in May in order to pursue that. And like, it's really, Kyle, been so like exciting and trippy. And because again, I haven't really had something new to say when someone asks me like how I am, what's up, for like a very long time. And I think that that's something that I always really gave a lot of credence to. I've always been someone who really cherishes stability. And I think the fact that I could sort of, that I didn't get hit by media layoffs, I was very lucky for. I think, I don't know, just being able to sort of point at my career, at sort of my time in this industry, in this city, in this life, and say like, yep, that's who I am, was so gratifying for so long until it kind of wasn't anymore. And like, to be able to then have this other interest of mine really sort of popping up and sort of, again, this set of languages, this medium to work in, has just been really, really exciting. Like just, it's exciting to be excited again. And so it's a full-time program for the next 2 years, which is why I also decided to step away from my full-time work, and it's starting in 2 weeks. I have orientation literally next week, and then classes start. I just finalized my class schedule, so I'm really in this kind of like liminal moment that is certainly a career change. I would say it's sort of an artistic shift or evolution, if nothing else. I'm gonna make a bunch of new friends, which is like nerve-wracking and really exciting, but no, I really, it feels really gratifying to be able to consider games as a medium, as opposed to just this thing that I could experience, something that I can now sort of get my hands dirty in and really kind of tinker with. It is just like such a joy.
Yeah. Your story captivated me, or just like it grabbed me immediately. I think you put up a post on Instagram. I've been following you for a while. I think I was introduced to you through, not formally, but through your, I think, appearances on Into the Aether and as a show that, and friends that we both have. So started following you on Instagram, and then I saw this post, your post kind of explaining exactly what you just described, how you're taking this step away, how you're extremely lucky to be able to be doing this. And that struck me, it struck a chord in me, and I think many others of, for me personally, journalism is something I always wanted to get into. And the time that you spoke of, the early 2010s, whatever it happened to be, when media was sort of popping off in my career, I did a little stint I didn't actually work at any news organizations, but I had a hand in the news media world. It wasn't as a journalist, but it was on the periphery of all of it, on the tech space. And that was as close as I ever got, but it was very exciting to me. And it's, again, something I wanted to pursue, is jump into journalism, specifically games journalism. And I feel like that moment passed, and I just kept going deeper and deeper into my tech background, my tech professional life. And then when I saw you, somebody who's actually living that life of a journalist, that the life that I thought I wanted, saying they're stepping away to go pursue this other thing that seems equally as satisfying, if not more so, about creating things, building things. One of the dreams I had growing up was to be a Disney Imagineer, because I just wanted to use technology to build experiences and stories. And like you, I also love video games, and there's an element of that too. I tinker with Game Boy modding on the side, where I've started digging into electronics and how they work. And even beyond that, like how things like a Raspberry Pi and the electronics there interact with, how you can interact with them with software and things like this. So expanding my mind there, but then again, watching you yourself step away from what it is you're doing. And that luck that you described, that privilege you described, is obviously there, but the fact that you are, makes it no less scary, I think, being able to do that, step away and focus on this path that I think a lot of people would be envious, but are also probably very excited to watch and see what happens here, and are very curious to see how you start exploring this space. So, I mean, with that, you've got 2 weeks until school starts. You've got to be terribly excited about that orientation coming up. I can only picture myself in your shoes I would be giddy right now. I'd be like, I can't wait for that first day of school, right?
I'm already kind of mentally planning my first day of school outfit.
Nice.
I never thought I'd have a first day of school again.
Yes. Did you go back to school shopping? Have you picked out your Lisa Frank stuff?
No, I will say that I said this in the piece, but one of the only drawbacks of giving up your job is that you do give up a full-time salary. Yeah, so yeah. I'd say I'm more in the sort of reduce, reuse, recycle era right now.
Pencils are looking a little pricey right now. Yeah,
exactly.
Right, okay.
Exactly.
For sure. Oh man, it's just so cool. Well, let's jump into kind of your background. You touched on loving games. You touched on them being a big part of your life, your partner's life, maybe for as long as you can remember. And I got to imagine, you sort of answered this, but this next step, this next chapter of your life probably owes itself to your love of video games at some level. Yes, knitting and anything with, hands-on work also there, but I've got to imagine that games play a big part in it. Do you think is that fair to say?
100%. I think I've been thinking a lot recently about sort of why it is that games in particular have grabbed me so much. And sort of by extension, I have a number of people in my life who I'm very close to who just don't like or get games at all. To them, it's just a complete, I don't think they think of it as a waste of time. There's not sort of the moral quadrant to it, especially not anymore. But that sense of sort of why did games get their hooks in me versus, someone else who I otherwise have very similar tastes with. And I think so much of it has to do with just straight up immersion. I think I've always been someone who really, if I'm into something, if I was into a book series or a song or what have you, I would read it over and over again. I would play it over and over again. I think I've always really liked like, again, it actually kind of comes back to wanting to reverse engineer things, break them down to their component parts and build them back up again. I think the way that I have loved things has often been, for maybe want of a better word, obsessive. I really like to catalog. I like to know everything about something. And I think a game just lends itself so uniquely well to that your experience of it is always necessarily going to be different than someone else's, and that there's often going to be sort of this chance to move around a world in your own time, at your own pace, go back to it over and over again. I even think about Pokemon was my, sort of earliest entree into games, like Pokemon Blue. Like I was obsessive. I got all 150 Pokemon manually, like probably before the age of 10. And now I'm like, where is that wherewithal? Like, I don't know that I could do that now. But there was that element. But then I think that another suite of games, very different, that was so seminal for me was when I was a teenager. The Sims was really just like, I played, oh my God, like honestly, thank God we didn't have like hour counters at the time, because like I don't want to know how many like actually maybe tens of thousands of hours of The Sims I played.
Yeah, that's a series where you just get lost in it and all of a sudden 8 hours have gone by. I remember in college, I went to work one day. I was living with my family at the time. My brother was, I think the moment I went to work, it was an 8-hour shift. I went to work. My brother was playing The Sims. I got back from work. My brother was still playing The Sims. I'm like, dude, what? Are you serious right now? He like looked up like he didn't know what had happened. It was wild.
Yeah, I relate to him so strongly. I have been that. I have in the part of my brain where childhood memories live, like there are memories of The Sims, like
you're in the house.
Yeah, no, literally that sort of like isometric view is like indelible. I don't know. And so I think that like, obviously there are so many things that are compelling about that particular game, but I do think, right, this sort of sense of what it did for time to me, certainly the sense of sort of what it did, I think I would have even called control. Like I think that I have this is really, I would say, sort of the underlying theme of my first book is sort of the desire for control in a world where we really don't have that much of it at all. And sort of to what degree is it useful? Is it healthy? Is it feasible to try and get a little more, to get some structure, to get some rules, to break things down? To what degree do you need to let go and sort of just allow for the things that are going to happen? And I think that that's something that I've always been very acutely aware of in my own life. It's I don't think it's a really original topic in all of human history, but certainly very, very front of mind for me. And I do think that games and simulation games, sure, but also all kinds of games, really, like even the idea of just a first person game in general, sort of disambiguating these systems and sort of the mechanics of life. And sort of, I think I've always been fascinated in, okay, how did they break this down? How did The Sims try and sort of document and capture life according to this set of rules? What did they choose to leave out? What did they, why is there a hygiene bar, but there isn't a, hopes and dreams bar, which, then later they did remedy in later games. And like, I don't think that I would have articulated that as such when I was 12 and just like making a house of my crushes so that like they'd all kiss me. But like, I do think even then that sense of like, what are the levers here that I can pull? What happens when I pull them? How can I sort of reach into the corners of this thing? What feels good for me? What's my rhythm? I think that that's just like a sensation I've always courted in every aspect of my life. And games really serve that up in such a like crystallized way.
Yeah, it's funny you say that again, back on The Sims. Like I do, until you said that, I'd never really thought about it. I do flash on that, like those bars. And at some point in The Sims, as you're playing it, it just feels kind of like this open simulation. You can do whatever you want. But I always felt like on the back end, there did seem to be stages. Like there was a difficulty curve that would start, escalating over time. And maybe that's just a byproduct of like, oh, now you have a kid, you have a spouse, you have friends, you're trying to manage all this stuff. And to manage all those different bars, what you could easily do at the beginning of the game, then starts becoming this challenge of like, I can't do everything. I've got to let some things go. And in my own life today, that's something I feel like I experience all the time.
Absolutely.
To my wife and myself, our daughter, and then just managing work in the house and trying to stay up with other relationships, doing side hobbies, like a podcast or whatever it happens to be. Like you can't keep everything afloat 100% all the time. So what are you going to sacrifice? Is it your bladder? Hopefully not. Or is it, your social life or food or whatever it happens to be? It's pretty wild that it felt like for V1 of The Sims, they kind of got that, they kind of nailed that anxiety.
Totally.
Right. And maybe taught kids or folks of our age, like, hey, this is what to get ready for in the later stages of your life, potentially.
No, absolutely. And I think it's so interesting you say that, Kyle, because I think of Persona as another series that really kind of gets at the sort of overtness of you do not have enough time for everything. You know, some installments more explicitly than others, but like the nature of sort of a calendar in a game. Fire Emblem, you know, has the calendar of 3 houses. It's been really interesting to sort of see that become such a popular mechanic, this idea. And in fact, even in some of my own game ideas that I've been, you know, futzing around on, there is sort of that idea of time is passing. How are you going to choose to spend yours? That determines sort of what kind of experience you have. And like, you know, it's kind of pat maybe to say, and it's like, it's because we're all going to die one day. And that's just sort of like our central set of concerns. But I think that like the way that a game can sort of elegantly and in many ways non-scarily communicate that sort of idea, as opposed to, you know, a book or a movie or a piece of more sort of, you know, traditional temporally timed media is noteworthy, and is something that I think I find myself extremely drawn to and very interested in. Like, sort of, it's funny, the older I get and the more into making games myself that I get, the more I think I do fixate on some of those like little mechanics in various games. Like, I'll sort of come away being like, oh, I didn't love that game, but the thing they did with the concept of time was so fascinating that, you know, it's easier to sort of pick and choose at that point.
Indeed. I was going to actually ask about that with regard to mechanics. I played, I was tinkering with some of your little micro projects and games that you have on itch.io. First and foremost, I just want to say I was clicking through 75 Memories, the kind of journal that you set up. It feels very, very akin to the dream sequences in Kingdom Hearts, just the way it's laid out. And your writing, it feels it feels much like that. I just finished a playthrough of the first Kingdom Hearts the other day. And so it's right there in front of mind for me. But I was like, oh my God, I feel like this is Sora talking to me right now. Very cool little experiment and project. But more specifically, I played Moving Goalposts, which is, you know, for all intents and purposes, extremely linear. It is linear. You're just a person walking in one direction, coming up across these nodes that are telling a story. And I immediately, as simple as that is, and as, you know, I guess on the contrary, lack of control, there's really only one thing you can do. It was still able to convey I felt like it was able to convey a story in a way that felt much more visceral than just reading an essay or reading a book or reading a blog post. Just by nature of the aesthetic of the game, the way the words are presented, it obviously showcases what you described earlier of that challenge of like are words too fickle at this point? Do I need something more to kind of broadcast my emotions, my feelings, whatever it happens to be? The set of tools I have to tell the stories I want seem to be kind of going beyond just the use of words, but the use of words is actually core to that experience, right? And I think there's just some like cyclical thinking in there where it's like, yes, I want this larger palette, but then I also go back to how important my words are. And anyway, I just felt like it was a very moving story, as simple as it was, the however many minutes it takes to play through and just kind of walk through. It was a demonstration of, the brilliance of the medium as you are exploring it. And so I'm curious, as you've been building these little experiences and talking about breaking things down, reverse engineering, there are obviously separate components to each one of these. There's art, there's the engineering of it, the programming, the coding, the story or narrative design around it. What have you felt has been the easiest part of this, the most natural part of this, and what has been the most challenging part of building these?
That's a great question. And also, thank you so much for taking such care talking about that piece. That was actually something I made during a game jam. In fact, the first one that I ever hosted, which was 3 hours long, start to finish. And I was like, you know what, I got to do something too. And it was actually interesting to me in that moment that I did sort of gravitate to something that was very, very simple to code. The art was very, very simple, but it was sort of this little poem, almost this piece of writing. Yeah. And I think that like for a long time, I think I thought I was programming in order to outrun writing. And it's really turned out, I think, especially in this last year, as I've really kind of gotten my tool sets a little more polished up, that like what I am making are sort of containers for writing in some ways. And I think something I really do want to play with, and that I think I am the worst at so far, that I'm finding to be the most difficult, and in fact, still the most abstract, is sort of how do I let go? How do I make these experiences not so linear? Like, what is the version of that piece that does double back or loop around, or where you have the the wherewithal to go in the other direction. What happens then? What happens there? And like, I'm so excited to have the time and space to really start to work those questions out, because to me, that's actually kind of the fundamental, philosophy of why you would make a game versus writing a book or a choose your own adventure or whatever in the first place. And so I guess really sort of the game design of it all, it's one thing where I can sort of make puzzles, but sort of the idea of where does a puzzle meet a narrative and sort of what happens there? How do I sort of make the form follow the function in a way that feels both like legible to a player, user, reader, I can never come up with the noun, and also feels, true to my vision and sort of what I'm trying to express. And like, I have found it's quite a chicken and egg process for me so far. Like, I have lots and lots of sort of like wireframes and notes written down, but like, I'm still not making anything sort of big or intricate enough that I even have like a fully fleshed out design doc before I start. Like, a lot of what I'm making when I make these little games, these little experiences is very dictated by this relatively small tool set that I have, that I am a self-taught programmer. I'm using Game Maker Studio for the most part. I use Bitsy, which is the engine that piece was written in, which I love, but it's, it's a little more simple. You only can have 3 colors at a time per palette. It's all 8-bit. There's a lot more limitation. And I think sort of something that this entire process over these last few years has really taught me is to allow for the limitations to breed creativity. I think it's very easy sometimes to think, I'm not even going to bother trying to do this until I can do something really sophisticated. Like, why would I even try making this little game until I could do a fully fleshed out inventory system? And I think I found that it was just really so much better to start and to just make these little 2-minute snippets and get them into people's hands and figure out like, what would I do next time around? How would I build this out? What piece of this am I going to sort of like salvage and then bring into the next project? Because all of them are sort of these funny patchworks of sort of everything I've learned before. And so I think that like on sort of the philosophical level, that's been both sort of the easiest and hardest thing, is like just doing it and sort of allowing myself to not have it ever be perfect or done, and sort of not be like, well, you haven't gotten an A in coding yet, so like therefore how could you possibly release this to the world? And just being like, you know what, I want to make a notebook, and if I can make it randomly generate, then like so much the better. So it's been sort of a humbling, like artistic, I'd say, journey as well as just mechanical.
Sure. On the mechanical side, more specifically, do you find, like I was playing, again, when I was playing Moving Goalposts, I was sitting there going like, I don't know if I have the patience to build pixel art. Like, so I've done a little bit of, I've tried my hand at making some games in Godot and Unity, and working with assets that have been supplied or whatever, which is great. And then every time I'm like, I'm going to see if I can make my own assets, and I start chipping away. I did this with the forgetting the name of the engine, whatever's used for the play date. And I started tinkering with their engine, and it gives you like a template to work with. And I started playing with the pixel art, going like, I just don't have the patience for this. I want to get in more into the programming side of things, making things move. I don't, as much as I appreciate art, I don't fancy myself as an artist in that way, as a visual artist in any way. And so that's a part that I always want to skip. I'm curious if do you find the art a satisfying, fun part of it? Do you find the engineering, the programming satisfying and fun? Like where?
I love all of them, and they feel so in concert with one another. Where, I think as far as the art goes, that's where the textile background really has like a true one-to-one. Literally, like a pixel is a stitch. Like I've been doing color work knitting and, cross stitch basically my entire life. Like that is pixel art, I had years ago, I would like sell hats where I'd like knitted phrases onto them, and it's like that was literally pixel art right there. I guess I made a pixel font for myself, in 2015, and just didn't know that that's what I was doing. And so I found that really gratifying, and I think that actually does dovetail with the idea of limitation, where like very early on I was kind of like, what's almost like the lowest, I was like, I'm not going to learn to do 3D modeling and also how to like do all of this stuff from scratch. I want to start with something that's simple, that's legible, that maybe sort of does harken back to my own experience of playing games, certainly as a kid. But really, it's the programming that I think took me the most by surprise and has sort of, I would say most directly led me in this other direction where it's funny, Kyle, when I first started, I'd really kind of thought I will try and find as low or no code a way to do all this as possible. Like I said, programming's not for me. I'm not a numbers person, blah, blah, blah. And I think I'd seen it almost more as like, well, you're going to have to understand enough that you can like tweak stuff. And then I was like, well, you're going to have to understand enough that you can tweak stuff and then customize it. And then eventually I sort of glanced up and I was like, oh my God, I love programming. It really just feels so satisfying in the way that playing games can feel satisfying.
Yes, exactly.
So much of it is organizing, is order of operations, is figuring out sort of, if I put this here now, what's going to have to happen in the future in order to, have that all coalesce in a way that feels elegant. And like, maybe that doesn't sound fun to people as I'm describing it. It's like putting together IKEA furniture. But like, I do think that sense of satisfaction and of completing tasks and of sort of seeing the completeness of something, programming just feels so like elegant to me in that way. And in a way I was really surprised and humbled by, honestly. Like it's been, I think, really gratifying. And sorry, I keep using that word, but I think it sort of shows where my head's at right now, to sort of realize that like my brain had another room in it that I didn't know about, that I wasn't I wasn't just the words person, that actually I could find pattern and poetry and promise in sort of this completely other set of rules and media. So programming has really kind of been the thing that I would almost say I've taken in a direction that's like even further away from games. Like you mentioned the piece I did about the notebook piece, like that's like almost not a game at all. It's almost closer to like a programmed essay, I guess, like a poem. I don't really know what I would call it, but I've been very interested in sort of how do I take these little pieces of code, where should they live, be it online, be it in person, like what is that atomic unit? And I don't know that it always necessarily has to be a game, but I also think by that same token, I'm trying to be a lot more generous and expansive with my definition of a game. Like, so I would say, I mentioned that engine Bitsy, and I just really want to shout it out because I think what's so special about it, it's made by one developer, really maintained lovingly by this, small but mighty community. And there are so many of these like beautiful, sort of moody, abstract little experiences that are created with that engine. I think it's described actually as a little game engine for little worlds, which is a good way to describe it, because like you can sort of beg the question of like, is it a game if I'm just sort of going from start to finish? But like it is interactive in a way that feels, somehow special, somehow transportive. And so I've been really over the last couple of years enjoying so many of those and falling down sort of so many rabbit holes of, again, some of these games that are like 90 seconds long. Although there are people who also manage to make these amazing like hour-long experiences with like the tiniest engine you can imagine, which I always love too. But it's I think it's been, honestly, even just on a creative and personal level, I think being able to sort of have that expansive definition has allowed me to feel a little more creative, that I didn't have to sort of start teaching myself and then be like, well, what's the MMORPG? Like there wasn't sort of the like, how do you find the industry application here, or what's the right way to make a game? I think sort of being able to experience other people's work in such a sort of broad sense made it feel like my own sort of brain and imagination could be broad as well, which has just been like really fun. I'm having fun.
That's awesome. I think games as a medium or whatever you want to call it is interesting to find yourself. There's probably other things that do this too. Like, I've done a lot of writing on my blog and fancied myself that, one day I'd want to be a writer and do that professionally or whatever. I've also played music in bands and things like that. There's a guitar hanging on my wall and one behind me and all that stuff. And then again, dabbling in games. It's such a, obviously it brings together so many different mediums and art forms into one that if you start exploring it, I think you're right. You can absolutely find something that maybe you didn't realize about yourself, or you can find that, that's the medium that I really enjoy doing, or that's the piece of art I really enjoy. I enjoy the music, not necessarily all these other things, but that's the thing I'm really drilling into. And with programming, you're right. Like, I feel like that is the thing that compels me to want to make games or build games. And it's not because I tried my hand at it with making games, but it was all from like, starting at MySpace and working with HTML and then getting into, in my tech career, being around software and development and, working on web apps or whatever it happens to be, has taught me that I do actually enjoy. I find it very satisfying to program and code, even if I'm not a trained software engineer or developer. I can play one on TV, but I'm not sure I can, actually hack it in a professional setting, at least not yet. But it is something that I want to chase. And I want to, because I love games, I would love to chase that aspect of games as well, like work on the programming or tech side of it, because it is fascinating. You are absolutely, what you said about programming feeling like a game in some way, I've had that same thought for a while now. Like games are very satisfying when you beat that boss or you complete that level or beat the game entirely. But I've never felt more satisfaction in challenge than banging my head against a coding problem for hours, days, weeks even. And then you have that shower thought where you're like, wait a second, if I do it this way, I wonder if that would work. And you try it out and all of a sudden it works and your world just lights up. And like, it's hard to describe what that feeling is. It's like the most difficult puzzle and you finally solved it. And that's something I get from video games. It's something I get from puzzle games specifically. But I don't get the satisfaction more than when it's a programming challenge and when I've solved that problem inside of when I'm coding or programming.
I could not agree more. In fact, I think that chasing that high made me derail my entire life, essentially. Right. It was really this feeling. I could not agree more of, I think it goes back to that sense of control, right? Of I live in a world right now where this problem is intractable, where I am not the type of person who can get through it. It has come up against me. It is an obstacle. Yeah. And then all of a sudden, that's not the case anymore. Like the future has changed. You have gotten through to the other side. And again, I think that that's silly and overblown if we're talking about like, right, CSS or whatever. But I think that like something I think of so much when it comes to making anything, any sort of creativity is sort of where do you find those sort of nodes that extrapolate outward, that you can take that lesson and sort of think of it in a broader sense. How do you take it into your professional life, into your social life, into the world at large? Like I think that sort of that sense of expansiveness and possibility is something that like I'm going to be chasing forever. And it feels really good to have found sort of in this unlikely place.
Yeah, for sure. To get back to games specifically, I know you were talking about it before, but like those games that were foundational to you growing up, Pokemon you mentioned, and you can see that maybe it's indirectly, but I feel like I saw that immediately when I was playing Moving Goalposts and everything else. Like, oh yeah, the way the dialogue is written here, the way just it's laid out, it feels very Pokemon to me. Sims, Persona you mentioned, Fire Emblem you mentioned. What are and I don't know if that's true of the question I'm asking here about those childhood memories, like where it all started for you. But I am curious from that I think you mentioned it was Game Boy Color is where that foundation began. Bring yourself back to that moment.
Oh yeah, I actually have a pretty distinct memory of it. I don't know if I was given the Game Boy before or during, but I do remember that my parents were taking me and my siblings, I have a little brother and a little sister, to visit my dad's parents who were then living in Florida. And I think I'd recently gotten the Game Boy or I was given the Game Boy on the trip. But I just remember being so immersed in it. And like, I think it was like an hour drive from the airport to the house and it was sticky. And, you're in like a minivan with like the velvet seats or whatever. And I just remember so like, I remember that feeling. You know what else I remember is the little, it didn't have a backlight, the Game Boy Color.
Sure.
And so you needed the little curly light that plugged into the port. And I remember that. I remember like getting to my grandparents at like dusk, it was like after the sun had set and needing to like plug this like horrible purple thing into my Game Boy and just being so, it was almost like finding an ancient text or something, like this idea that there was so much contained in this. Like I was so excited immediately about just sort of the fact that like I had my own particular Bulbasaur, that I was going to name the thing I was going to name it, and that it was growing up in such a way as determined by my actions. Like it really did feel like this little world in my hand. And like I said, I went on to be just completely exhaustive with it. Like I tracked down every possible Pokemon. Like I don't even think, it wasn't the kind of thing where I was like a very obsessive, like pedantic person. Like I don't think I would have cared about like EV training or anything at the time. It was more just like, how do I scour every inch of this world? Like what were, and even just like, I remember reading all the little descriptions in the Pokedex and like being so taken by sort of the simplicity and sometimes the strangeness of the little, descriptors of these creatures. It really felt to me like such a novel and fresh and immersive way to build a world. And so like, that was such a foundational experience. And like, I think I've always sort of been an RPG person first and foremost. Like, it's certainly varied over the years. There are many, many other genres that I love, but sort of that like you're a little guy running around, you are sort of collecting things in this world, you are figuring out where you want to go next, you're leveling up, you have sort of this sense of gamified accomplishment. That's always been sort of the hallmark, I think, of what I've been drawn to. Because then I will say the next sort of, there was The Sims, certainly Roller Coaster Tycoon, kind of the like childhood economy games, like all those. But I would say the sort of other really important lodestar for me, games-wise, when I was younger, was The Legend of Zelda, and specifically Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. I think Majora's Mask is pretty much bar none my favorite game ever. And I played those games for 10, 12 years, like almost every year probably. I think that I was so taken with that sort of hybrid feeling of here they are telling a story, there is a narrative, but also you are able to sort of take it at your own pace to explore, to find something incredibly difficult and against all odds overcome it. Like I remember those games, like Ocarina felt like the hardest game ever to me for many, many years, in a way that maybe it wouldn't now, but like maybe it still would. And also around the same time, I was, and I guess when I say the same time, I mean sort of going into my post-college life when I was getting into journalism, working at BuzzFeed, certainly, I did start writing a bit about video games. I would never have considered myself a games journalist, like I was not doing any kind of reporting, but I did do a fair amount of, game essays, sometimes reviews, sort of looking at games maybe through like a bit of a cultural or personal or social lens. And probably my favorite piece of game writing I've ever done was probably like 10 years ago at this point, and it was about Majora's Mask. And I remember at the time I was like in a really, really bad heightened state of anxiety. I think I'd been going through a big breakup. I didn't feel like I had my sea legs sort of in the city in my own life. And I wrote this piece about letting the moon fall in Majora's Mask, in running out, the 72 hours as Link, and just sort of like being calm and still while you watch the thing that you have feared happen. And of course, it's a bit of a trite metaphor, but I think being able to kind of put things in those terms for me at the time really, I don't think a book could have done that. I don't think a movie could have done that. I think it was me as Link on that screen that felt so visceral, that felt so, I wouldn't say that it's the same as like immersion therapy necessarily, but I think that there is that feeling of I am a little bit closer to this experience, and I am sort of choosing to put my time, my attention, whatever on the line. So I always do think about that time too as one that was really, really important for me when it came to games, and sort of realizing these games I've been playing my entire life have really taught me some valuable lessons, and really serve as quite salient metaphors sometimes for things that I'm dealing with in my own life.
Yeah, but and you're describing that visceral. I mean, between both Pokemon and Majora's Mask or Ocarina of Time, you're describing what you went, going back to the beginning here, that control, that agency, that connection you have to the character on the screen as being a direct connection to you, your input, or even just all of a sudden you're becoming that individual or that character. Like you can see when you say step into somebody's footsteps, you're literally quite doing that. You're controlling their footsteps. Like you have to, there's no other way. And so, yes, it's extremely powerful. This on the show, a number of, anybody who's listening now, who's listened to the back catalog will know that we talk a lot about these passive experiences versus participatory experiences. And I think you could the more I think about it, I think you could slice and dice any type of medium as passive or participatory. But I would think like, film being more passive, you're sort of forced to watch the story that's being presented to you. I think of books as a bit more passive as well. Yes, I think there's a participatory nature of having to create the world and imagine the world as it's going, but you're following along, in most cases, you're following along a story that's taking place, and just kind of like, you're right, you're along for the ride. And with games, it's obviously participating. I think of all the different types of mediums, that is the one that forces you to participate. You have to participate in it. It's something unique to the medium that does make it way more powerful, way more visceral. And you're able to, again, put yourself in the footsteps or the shoes of that character or whomever it happens to be.
No, absolutely. It's actually been really interesting even figuring out that like I think my brain kind of ebbs and flows sometimes with like there are months and months at a time when what I want are more inputs. I want to be I want to be reading a lot. I want to be listening a lot. I want to play a lot of games. I want to sort of be in that state of gathering. And then there are, periods of time, and I'm trying to make them happen more frequently than they have over the last, however many years, where I just want to create stuff, where it's just kind of like, okay, all of this inspiration and these ideas have really built up. And I think like partly what I'm trying to do with the next 2 years is really sort of have that time and space to have that be the making time, so I'm going to, put my money where my mouth is, as it were. I'm going to sort of get the skills to maybe express some of this stuff. And I think that has to that dovetails with sort of this idea of participatory versus passive as well. This sort of question of like, when are you asking questions versus when are you answering them? When are you fallow versus when are you, sowing? I'm actually not totally positive about the agricultural metaphor there, but no, I think that I think all of us being sort of attuned to our own rhythms in that sense can be really helpful, especially when, as you say, there's never enough time or energy to do even a tenth of what we would want to do. So it kind of becomes this question of like, how do I balance those things? How do I carve this time out?
Yeah, I mean, and speaking of balance, actually, it's good. Another good question, a good segue. You're in a unique part of your life right now where you have this little break from your professional life. It doesn't mean that you're not anxious about what's coming and trying to probably prepare yourself for what is coming. I imagine you have a little more time now to maybe enjoy video games or any other thing you want to enjoy at this moment. But how, maybe thinking back to when you were in journalism and maybe even looking forward about what's about to happen in your schooling and education, how were you balancing your time with games versus your professional life and life outside of even that, your personal life?
Man, sometimes I think not very well. Like I do think I can be a very all or nothing person. Like when I'm obsessed with playing a game like Elden Ring or whatever, I'm not doing anything else. I wasn't programming at the time. I was like barely probably talking to my partner, like really, really all in. But no, in general, I do think that like just kind of... I'm very fortunate that right now, like I'm 34, we don't have kids yet. We're sort of established in the city. I feel like I'm finally in this moment in my life where I do have that sort of ability to pause and to balance and to say, hey, okay, given XYZ thing, like given that I have this much time, what do I want to do? Honestly, I would say that like probably the biggest change I made that was kind of accidentally at the same time as all this, but does dovetail, is I quit drinking for the most part. I guess it was maybe a few months after I'd started programming. I did dry January of that year and then just kept it going for another like year and a half, basically. And like,
wow, congrats.
Thank you. I mean, look, I'm certainly not sober by any stretch, but it's just really not a part of my day-to-day life in any real way anymore, in a way that it had definitely become, I think, especially during the height of the pandemic, where, I was working remotely. I would shut my laptop at 6 p.m. and then pour a glass of wine and then another one. And I don't know, I think it again, I had entered my 30s at that point. I sort of settled down. I think, I'd always enjoyed going out with friends and having fun, but I don't think I enjoyed that feeling of, once again, being out of control and sort of this sense that I was maybe in the thrall of alcohol or that it was something that I was just doing as a matter of course, as opposed to something that I was choosing myself to do. So honestly, choosing to stop for whatever length of time felt almost like not a game. I don't want to, that sounds flip, but it was sort of this like, oh, I can choose to make my life, the texture of my life, of my days look a little bit different. And frankly, that also just gave me a lot more time. Like, because, I wasn't, drunk on weeknights or whatever, it meant that I sort of had that time for like, oh, if I wanted to do like a coding tutorial or like draw on my iPad, it was just like a lot more available to me than it had been before. And also I think it was sort of that, again, the kind of extrapolated lesson of, I could choose to make this big change in my life, that like, I think the thought of applying to grad school, which again is not like, it's very cliche to be like a woman in her 30s being like, what if I went to grad school? I'm not trying to sound like I'm like reinventing the wheel here, but any big change, which I'd had up until that point maybe been pretty shy or of risking, felt a lot more doable when it was like, well, you made this huge change in your own day-to-day life. It's not actually necessarily as hard or as impossible as it may seem to apply that thinking elsewhere. So that's actually probably how I like kind of spiritually and temporally like got the most time for it. But like I said, I don't think I've ever had like a great balanced sense of like, I wake up in the morning and from 10 to 12 is, quiet brain time and blah, blah, blah. Like, I think I am always someone who, if I'm interested in a project, if I'm learning something new, if I'm playing something I love, like I'm really going to go kind of whole hog on that. And then the next thing will come along. And I will say that the discipline comes in with, you just can't like drop it forever. You got to sort of keep it juggling nicely in order to make progress in all your various aspects.
Yeah. One of the things I think that could be challenging, and I echo those sentiments a lot. I did dry January of this last year, and I thought it was a great experience. I kind of got back on the wagon a bit, and now for other reasons, I'm off again, putting less pressure on myself. If I want to, or there's a party or whatever, sure, I'll have a drink. But
exactly,
I'm looking at it. I'm trying to view it now of like, how much time am I getting back? If I want to change my own trajectory or career or whatever it happens to be, is this something that's going to help that process in the sense that I might be able to get back some more time or some more concentration or be less tired or whatever it happens to be? And I think anything is better than nothing. It also comes with the weight of, I've got other things, like I mentioned, my daughter and stuff. It's just, needless to say, looking ahead, when you jump into this curriculum, when schooling starts, I'm putting myself in your shoes. I've got to imagine that the time spent focused on that curriculum is going to eat pretty hard into not necessarily those things that you want to build, because that's what you're going to be doing, but it's going to eat into that leisure, into that personal life, into that time playing games, actually, the things that you want to be building, or even crafting or anything else that you want to be doing. Do you have any anxiety about that? Is that something that you're thinking about?
It's definitely something that is very top of mind for me. I actually just like right before getting on this call, like fully finalized my schedule, including like a class I'm going to be TAing for and, what have you. So like, I really have a sense now of what it looks like. And you're absolutely right. It's going to be really intense. But I think the way I've been framing it is like, I am so excited to be able to have this sort of concentrated and quite finite period of time. Like, I'm absolutely positive that there will be many moments where it feels exhausting, where it feels like, oh my God, but I think it's going to go by really, really fast. I think, it's not even really 2 years, it's like 18 months. If you think about the school year ending in June of 2025 or whatever, I think that like, frankly, I was at my last job for 7 years. I was at my previous job for 5. Like, the thought that this is just going to be a blip compared to those, that it's even just half of my undergrad time, I think I'm sure that there will be periods where I'm like, wow, you're really like mainlining, all of this like artistic creation and learning and like kind of getting it all down in one. But I do think that part of why I even sort of staked out this time, why it took me a year and a half to really kind of like get the money in place, get the timing in place. Like, this is maybe a little bit TMI, but I think it's actually relevant to the discussion. My old company paid for egg freezing. So my partner and I decided to do that, kind of knowing that I would be leaving, I would be leaving behind that benefit, and also that I, would be focusing full time on this sort of pursuit for the next couple of years. And like all of those things, to be clear, again, I feel so fortunate and privileged to have, but it also was all in the service of like, how do I line this all up, given again that like so many things can and will happen that I can't predict, that I can't plan for, in order to give myself sort of this runway and this time and this space and even this community, like there were a lot of reasons why I decided to go with a grad program at all versus, okay, why not just sort of take 2 years off from work in order to, put together a curriculum myself, find some more ad hoc ways of learning this stuff. I think that was a big consideration. And I think having a cohort and sort of having this like, structured time, having, I like having professors. I like, it's an ungraded program pretty much, but like, I think it is nice to sort of have those people looking over your shoulder in some regard after being alone for so long. So I guess, yeah, all of that is to say like very much aware of it, really like, want to be taking care of my body and my health and like my friendships, but also really excited to be able to kind of like double down on it. I'm also really lucky that I live about a 15-minute walk from the campus, and we just re-signed our lease, which like is not something that was planned whatsoever, but like is a real benefit, that it's like I can literally like go home during lunch and, make a rice bowl or whatever, as opposed to buying a cheeseburger on campus. So like little things like that where, I think I could feel self-conscious a little bit, because I'm definitely going to be in like, I don't think I'm going to be one of the older people, but I think sort of the mean of the class will certainly be significantly younger than me. Like, I think there will be a lot of folks who are in their 20s who are doing this program. I'd felt a little bit at first, like, am I, is it past my time, blah, blah, blah. And realizing, no, having this sort of sense of security and stability, knowing that I'm 15 minutes away, like that really actually does make a huge difference in my quality of life, in my ability to maybe balance a bit, continue to be healthy while I do it. But I think it's like, I have all these plans. I've tried to line up everything, and then I'm just going to have to like let it rip and see how it all goes.
Yeah, so. Of course. We'll check back in exactly. 6 months or a year and see how you're holding on. What's the end goal here? 2 years from now, this is all done. It's all said and done. What do you want to happen?
I think there's a couple different ways it could manifest. I could see myself, like I said, wanting to sort of take this new skill set and sort of circle back around to where I've been, to sort of be going back to digital media, to media in general, whatever that might look like, and sort of be applying this and approaching it from a different angle. Like I could really see myself wanting to be on, like, for example, like the New York Times games team or Interactive's desk. Like those, a lot of people from this program go on to do things like that. And I could really see that being quite satisfying and maybe sort of being a good way to find, like, you know, the happy medium of this new sort of skill set I want to be exploring in an environment that maybe I'm more familiar with. I could also see myself going in more of a like techie or education background. Like those would be sort of the two industries I think that I could like see myself. Like honestly, like there's a non-zero chance I want to be like applying to PM roles, you know, where it's like I am someone who is a good manager and conversant in both sort of how humans interact with one another, but hopefully by the time I graduate, a lot more in sort of where computing and technology comes into that and how to understand sort of what I'm looking at and how to talk about it all. And then I think that like the pie in the sky, like maybe dream, maybe nightmare scenario is making my own thing. Like a lot of people leave this program in particular and, you know, launch their own firm, be that a design consulting firm or, you know, I think I could really see myself doing like editorial and narrative consulting and seeing how that plays out in both like, you know, journalistic and maybe even branded work, but also in sort of the games and interactives realm. And like, I want to see kind of what comes up. Like I'm going to start applying to like internships pretty soon, which is really funny to be like, hi, I'm your 35-year-old intern. But I want to spend this time not only honing sort of these technical skills and making, you know, work that I'm proud of, but really sort of narrowing down what does this next phase of my life look like. And I think pound for pound, I would be surprised if what it looked like was exactly the same sort of like 9 to 5, you know, corporate journalism job that I've been doing up until now. I think my brain and body need some kind of new pathways to be formed, but I want to figure out exactly what those are. And again, like I keep coming back to it, but like the luck I feel, the privilege I feel to be able to like take this moment and take this beat like is unparalleled and is something that like I want to take advantage of. I like, you know, I want to have fun and I want to like mess around, but I want to use this time well. I want it to like set me up for this next phase of my life, if at all possible.
Yeah. I glossed over this earlier and I meant to ask, what was the impetus for getting into journalism?
Oh, you know, I think it was sort of a lot of things. I mean, I did the school paper in college. I always loved that. I mean, I was the humor editor, so like it wasn't like I was doing like, you know, the hardcore reporting, but I think I always loved communication, right? Like I always loved writing in such a way that people would read or, you know, helping figure out how to shape like how to be efficient in communication, how to be useful in communication. I think that journalism has really scratched a lot of those, like it lives at a nice sort of intersection of creativity and utility. But again, like my partner is in journalism and he is someone who is so deeply devoted to it. Like the project of journalism, the sort of promise of journalism is something that he really truly like sees himself as sort of a standard bearer of. And he might make fun of me, you know, I think that's maybe a bit dramatic, but like he has always sort of had that certainty. And I never really did. And not to say that like I was like, screw this, blah, blah, blah. But I think it was sort of more, hey, this is the 85% compatibility on the career test of it all, you know, where here it went. And I don't want to sound ungrateful because it was really, really so special to get to sort of be on the internet in these moments when we were figuring out that there was sort of this possibility space in this audience. But I gotta say too, it's been a real bummer in a lot of ways. Like I think that part of what I'm feeling now, certainly, and part of what colors how I speak about it is, you know, there have just been awful permanent contractions and shakeups in the industry. Like, I mean, my partner got laid off like 2 weeks after we got engaged last year, you know, like my own company, Vox, which, you know, I think was actually far and away one of the most stable ones and remains so, still had 2 rounds of layoffs last year that affected editorial employees. Like, I think there's a real sense of precarity. And like, I'd like to think and hope that like we've maybe seen the bottom of that, but like it's a real far cry from how it was in 2013, 2014, where there was was sort of this infusion of free VC cash. And, we don't have to get too into it, but there were a lot of promises made by a lot of, big players in the tech industry that really never materialized and really sort of exploited some of the tenets of journalism in such a way that, like, I got to tell you, like, anecdotally, more than half my friends certainly are in journalism in New York, because that's sort of the nature of the beast. These are the people who I met right out of college. And of that number, I would say half again are out of work or underemployed. Wow. And these are, I'm biased, but unbelievably talented, experienced, thoughtful people who have made amazing things, who have amazing ideas, and all they want is like some dignity in their workplace. Right. And that's become a lot more like vanishingly hard to achieve, I think, in some regards. And like, it's not to say that I was like turning tail from that. Like I said, I think it was much more personally motivated, where I was already kind of in this moment of what else do I want to be learning? Sort of how do I expand on this? But I do think there was a moment of like, man, I don't want to get shown the door here, like I'm already feeling a little bit like, is this the place for me? At the same time that it's really quite inhospitable. Do I still need to be here? I think was a big question. And so, I'm actually really in that, like, I know that sounds quite negative. I actually am really optimistic about sort of what I've been seeing, especially in the last couple of years, when it comes to sort of a groundswell of like, owner, like reporter owned journalism. And like I think about like Defector, 404, like Hellgate is this great local New York one. These are collectives of maybe like half a dozen, sometimes a dozen journalists, where they own the means of production and they are, able to pay their own salaries. And like, it's not going to make anyone a millionaire. And maybe these aren't publications that are going to last forever, but it feels like they're actually a lot more sustainable than having like a fickle billionaire, for example, like own your company. And all of that is to say, I think that's easy to sort of, or not easy, but it's possible to extrapolate outward and say, hey, maybe this is sort of where labor is going in general, or where creative labor could maybe find some happy medium is, in these medium-sized spaces. Maybe it doesn't have to be you go it alone or you're part of this massive conglomerate, even though, the market would suggest that certainly is the case. Mm-hmm. And so like, I sort of straddle this line between not wanting to sound naive and not wanting to sound cynical, and sort of knowing that I think journalism and storytelling and reaching people is always going to be such a fundamental human desire, that there will always be an industry and there will always be sort of room for people who want it, but that it is changing drastically, and sort of figuring out what that all shakes out to look like in this current moment is a big project. And I think that there are really, really smart people who have been really stymied by that project. So that's kind of that's where I am right now vis-a-vis journalism, which, love it very much. But I think I am relieved as we enter the 2024 election to not currently be working in a newsroom, shall we say.
Yeah, no joke. Oh my God. And I mean, a lot of the stuff you said parallels a lot of what's going on in the games industry as well. I think that's also wrought with peril and
absolutely,
and, figuring itself out between.
And that's a non-zero reason, I gotta say, Kyle, that like early on I was like, I don't want to go to a game design program. Like, all the respect in the world, and more than anything, it was that I wanted a bit more of a like holistic approach, but also like, I do not at the present moment want to be training to enter the games industry in order to support myself necessarily. I think a lot, we'll see sort of what it winds up looking like if I'd even have, the privilege of doing that at any point in my life other than as a hobbyist. But like, it really felt like, do I need to go from this particular frying pan into this particular fire necessarily? Right.
But I mean, even just being part of that, I think everything you were going through in journalism probably clarified your calling of like, maybe this is the moment where I if I'm having this anxiety or if I'm seeing this turmoil, maybe this is the moment where that thing that always felt a little crazy may not feel as crazy anymore. And there might be some opportunity to go try this thing out. Right. So
absolutely. I think of it too as almost like the liberatory aspects of nihilism, right? Where it's like, look, there is no stable path, right? Like all these industries, everyone's backup to the backup industries are being rocked, let alone sort of the one that you'd maybe craved your entire life or studied for or whatever. So like, you kind of can't choose right, which means you kind of can't choose wrong. And as someone who has, I think, been often quite anxious about making the right choice, it's been a little bit fuck it, it's a little bit YOLO. It's a little bit like, if not now, when, because the old ways have not served me either.
Right. I'm curious if you have any thoughts or excitement about the future of games specifically. Again, things that you've been experimenting with, I would imagine shed some light on like, oh, I wonder if this is a path this goes down, or the way you're looking at games now has maybe changed. And if that has colored what you may think where games are headed, or maybe it's just simply the games you're playing and you're seeing new interesting themes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think kind of all of the above, where, first and foremost, what makes me so excited about games right now is that there are these tool sets available for those of us who never thought that we were the type of people who could make games. And, I think that like there's a lot to get into about sort of traditional gatekeeping and sort of where that lives and why that, mentality might be. But more than anything, I think it's just that right now in the world, like the fact that someone who literally had never programmed in her life, could watch tutorials for Game Maker Studio and come away with like a foundational knowledge of coding that I have been able to translate into like actual languages, like really speaks to how many people are working to make that possible. I think that like where I've really found so much excitement and sort of like inspiration and help has been in Discords. I think The Worst Garbage is certainly a space for that, but also all of these platforms, Game Maker, Bitsy, I think RPG Maker, Godot, any one of the platforms you could try has such a robust community of people who are often for free, giving their time, giving their expertise, really excited genuinely to have other people who are like, I'm an architect. I have never, coded in my life and I would like to figure out how to make a game, execute on that vision. And like, for all that, of course, like I think notwithstanding sort of the money of it all and how, you actually get a commercial product into the hands of people on an artistic level and on sort of a skills level, it really makes me excited to see what's coming out from those people, from those corners. Like I mentioned, like I in the last 2 years, probably more than in my entire life combined, I've played just like random ass games on itch, like just stuff, again, things that are 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15, things that are websites, things that are on your phone, like just sort of these snippets, in that sense, it actually reminds me of like the best of the internet in, the late 2007 through 2014, or whenever we want to consider the internet really fun and sort of pastiche in that regard. That makes me really, truly so excited and so invigorated. And even just also seeing, like, I think there's always going to be sort of the, mythos of the like auteur game developer, like the solo dev, but I do think of like Animal Well and sort of and Balatro and some of these like really exciting weird games that have come out, in recent years or in the last year, that are largely the vision of one person, and that now there are sort of these tool sets that you can execute on that. It's just been really, really gratifying to see where, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I'm like, it's like biting the inside of my mouth now. I'm just going to say gratifying over and over. No, that's fine. But seeing sort of where folks take these little prompts and take sort of the limitations of some of these genres is really exciting. And like, honestly, just like on a totally boring technical level, like I am so thrilled by the handhelds, by, the emulators, by the Steam Deck, by the fact that like, we can now have Delta on the iPhone, and I've just been playing like hours of Pokemon Unbound and Slice and Dice constantly. Like it's really kind of nice to be able to like have that ease of access where games actually feel, especially in this moment now where I am commuting again, I am sort of on the subway, I am going places in the world, that games can sort of slot into my life in that way, and that so many people, even the Playdate, as you mentioned, that there are these like really interesting experiments in sort of the form factor of a game. And that's something that I've always loved, for all that, like, I live with a boy. We have a big TV. Like my preference for playing games has always been that more sort of intimate, like, locked in mode that a handheld can bring. So I don't know. I'm very excited to see sort of where that all goes. And I think that, like, I mean, you yourself, as you're modding your Game Boys, like, I think that there's like watching people sort of, one of my professors next semester is also into Game Boy modding. There's just sort of this excitement that like, us normies can access some of this stuff, and that we can really find the beauty and the joy in how computing works and how it feels, and sort of where technology feels warm and feels human. I think that's like kind of what I'm going for here in general.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it that way either. Like the democratization of game making is there, but it also is very clearly it's communicating like this is how machines work. This is how computers work. And that's been around for ages. But now I think it's if I had these tools available to me when I was 10, 12, 15, whatever, to just tinker with when I had endless amounts of time, like I'm sure I would have done, gone bonkers with it. Like I mentioned, we were tinkering with MySpace back then, but that's really all we had. And it taught us a bit. Yes, I'm sure. But the fact that all these things out there exist now and can teach us more about how this technology is actually working and how to make it work and how to communicate, how to make it communicate, and that be more readily accessible than ever is quite amazing. And yeah, the portable side too. I wonder if there's my thinking there is like, I wonder if that's unique to our generation where, again, you described playing Pokemon on your Game Boy Color. You have this little world in the palm of your hand. And I think that immediately you start thinking to yourself, there's bigger and better games on my TV. I want those in my hand too. And now we actually get to have that. We can take those. You can take Elden Ring with you on the train if you want to, which is wild to think. And I think for us in our generation, that's very novel to have grown up with these things that we never imagined we'd be able to play that grand experience. We just have to imagine these smaller ones and try to like fill in the blanks with our heads. Now we just get the full thing right there, for better or worse. I think sometimes it's nice to have the limited experiences as well, but we get the full thing right there, more or less. And I wonder if that's going to feel as special to upcoming generations who are playing games. It's likely just normal for them, playing, timely today, playing Fortnite on your iPhone, which is now back on the phone in the EU today, as of this recording. But anyway, I think it's less unique for them. And I think maybe we see something special in that, in the portability of these, where it's not just like, I hope it's not taken for granted. I'm sure that there's a bit of it that maybe is the way that we much take for granted TV today, and generations who didn't have it or only had access to one or two channels are looking at us like, you have no idea how good you have this right now.
Right. No, and I love the way you put that it is sort of this like, maybe we're the last sort of like micro generation to have kind of site specific computing, right? That like, I remember when I got an iPhone, it was when I was in college, maybe right after, like, I had a life without one and getting one was sort of when it became a lot more sort of less localized, where it was sort of you can be experiencing stuff wherever, whenever. And again, so much to recommend that. I'm not really a Luddite. I really like having new fancy gadgets a lot of the time. But I do think that sense of sort of specialness of context, of sort of even memory formation is so tight in there.
Yeah. Quickly, lightning round, if you don't mind. What are your 5 favorite games of all time?
Ooh, okay. Yeah, it does fluctuate, but I think we sort of touched on it. I think let's go with The Sims, maybe The Sims 2 technically, but like, The Sims, oeuvre. Majora's Mask for sure. Of the Personas, let's say 3. Like 3 to me does the most, but like just kind of the Persona 3, 4, and 5 in general. Fire Emblem 3 Houses. What am I up to? That's 4?
That's 4.
Man,
Pick a wild card.
Yeah. Wild card. I was a teenage exocolonist. I'm going to put that one in there. This came out in maybe 2022. It was the last game I played before I decided to start making games myself. It was a game, and not to say that I like had the hubris of thinking I could make this by myself. It was made by a team, albeit a small one. But I remember the writing being so phenomenal. And for folks who aren't familiar with it, the title is I Was a Teenage Exocolonist. It's sort of a visual novel. It's nominally climate fiction, I would describe it as, but it's really lovely. The characters in particular are phenomenal. I think that there are things about it that are not perfect. I mean, literally, I was just talking about Fire Emblem 3 Houses. I obviously like games that are not perfect. But I think what this game did was really prove to me again and again why it should have been a game and nothing else. And it really felt current and modern, but not in a way that was ever going to feel dated. And that really was... That was the last game I played before I was like, you know what? I think I could start to deconstruct some of this stuff and see what sticks. So that remains special to me. I'll put that in at number 5.
That's cool. Would you consider that your like primary catalyst, or is it just like the thing that sent you over the edge?
I think the straw broke the camel's back. I think
Yeah.
I was always maybe gonna head in this direction. I'd been talking and thinking about it for a very long time. But when it came to sort of sitting down and being like, I want to see how this works. Okay. It's made up of dialogue boxes and menus. And the thing that like must be happening in the background is that there's some kind of tally system where I've spoken to this person X number of times. It was like, I really like, and again, I don't want to sound like I have the hubris to say that I did understand fully how to break down a sophisticated, professionally made game like that. But I could kind of take those pieces and start watching tutorials and reading textbooks and reading documentation and teach myself how to reverse engineer it a little bit. And like, that's what sort of gave rise to my first stabs and have really kind of characterized what I've been working on ever since. So yeah, well, I want to shout out that game. It's just lovely. I also just recommended it to a friend who's recovering from surgery, who texted me being like, Alanna, I'm obsessed. I've already finished, spoiler alert. And then we're like talking about how like who we romanced. And I was like, I heard you can romance 2 of them at once if you do blood. It's just fun to have that kind of interaction with someone years after a game comes out. You know, I really don't take that for granted.
That's awesome. And circling back to the very beginning of this conversation, what were you playing on your trip, if anything at all?
Oh, yeah. So honestly, literally up until like the minute before getting on this call, Slice and Dice. Again, I also think it came out in maybe 2021 or 2022. It's a roguelike. It is like the first game I've played that has managed to kind of unseat Slay the Spire as far as like a phone game that like makes you feel smart and dumb by terms playing it. You know, it's not very passive, but there is a fair amount left up to luck. It is so fun. I don't want to know how much I've played at that game. And I'm switching off with Pokemon Unbound, but I need to use the backbone in order to play that. The little like, you know, it clips on to make the like, I don't know, little handheld. And so that's like 1 degree further than Slice and Dice, which I can just like pull out and do one-handed. So switching off between those two, but it is nice to have them both on my phone, just like in my bag, especially as I, you know, gear up for the school year and I'm like running errands and stuff. I can just like pull it out on the subway.
Convenience is king. It's great.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for your time today. This has been incredible. Thanks for sharing your story. Again, I remain inspired by you, and I'm hoping that maybe even myself or folks listening can jump into their own adventure and see what comes of it, or find something new that they never knew that they had inside them as well. Where can people find you if they want to follow your story and see what you're up to?
Yeah, I think Instagram's probably the best place. Just Alanna Bean on Instagram. And then if you want to go directly to my itch page where I have all my little game experiments, it's just alannabean.itch.io. Thank you so much for having me, Kyle. This was such a wonderful conversation. Like I really enjoy talking about games in sort of both the, you know, day-to-day level, but also in the much more like high-minded philosophical sense too.
Of course. Well, I wish you the best of luck. Congratulations. Thank you so much. And you have a great rest of your day and weekend, I guess.
You as well. Thanks so much.
There you have it. My interview with Alanna Okun. Listening back to this episode, I was kind of floored by it. Not something I totally expected. I found this incredibly inspirational personally, and I hope you did too. I just think it's such an incredible thing to set aside what you're currently doing with something you've been focused on for a large chunk of your life to say, actually, no, I'm going to go check out this other thing that I've been exploring. Very cool that Alanna has found this new passion, this new world through video games. And video games are it's not just that she wants to create video games and be part of that world, but she wants to use this as a medium to express herself, which I find is very, very, very cool. I'm sure a lot of game developers are the same way, that this is something they feel they can get themselves out there with. Something maybe that they can't do with words or with art or whatever it happens to be. That games just, for whatever reason, tends to be a medium that they feel they can express themselves a little bit more. And so it's very cool to hear that Alanna has found that as well. I'm recording this outro right now a few weeks after I had spoken with Alanna, and she has actually started class. She has, I think, completed maybe her first week, and I admire it deeply. I think it's very cool. So reach out, give her some best wishes, good luck, all that jazz. And while you're at it, check out her games. You know, drop by her itch.io page. I found the games that she's created to be very interesting, to say the least, but very evocative, very emotive. And you can see what she's talking about. You can feel what she's talking about through the experiences that she's already created. Right now, how about a little self-promotion? So since the last episode with Tasha Sonart, I have actually been on a couple other podcasts as a guest. You will, if you recall, if you've been a listener for a while now, you'll recall I've had actually all of the folks from Into the Aether on Y Button, Brendan, Steven, and producer AJ, and producer of the show. Thanks again, AJ. They asked me to actually pop over to Into the Aether and help out there. So during the summer, Steven and Brendan took some time off, and over the course of 4 episodes, AJ filled the shoes of host for that show, and I happened to be on one of those episodes. The episode is titled The Right to Return, and it was with the great Dom Nero. So Dom and I got to talk a lot about being dads and what that means for our time spent playing video games, enjoying games, and what types of games we actually find comforting and that we're able to enjoy with the limited time we have as dads. Quite a fun episode. I'm endlessly thankful that those guys let me on the show and allowed me to talk about this stuff. I was also on an episode of the DLC podcast. The first episode of Y Button was with DLC co-host Christian Spicer, and Christian had asked me to join DLC as a guest. An incredible opportunity. I have been a fan of DLC for, oh my God, almost since they started, but close to probably 10 years now or so. And just the idea of even being on their show as a guest seemed very far-fetched, and it actually happened. So on July 28th, that's the episode, you'll see if you search for it, you'll see my name, Kyle Starr. It's got in the title Marvel Rivals, a Ranger, which is a game we talked about, some of the EA Sports College Football 25 that came out, and Dungeons of Hinterberg. But I got a chance to talk about some of my thoughts about what's going on in the industry at the moment, some of the games I'm playing and enjoying, and yeah, it was such a blast. It was everything I hoped it'd be. So thank you to the folks at DLC. Thank you to the folks at Into the Aether for allowing me to appear on those shows. And if you're a fan of my work here on Y Button, I'd love it if you went and checked out my appearances on those shows and gave those podcasts some love and a chance as well. If you enjoyed this episode of the show, please share it with a friend. The easiest thing you can do is share the website ybutton.online, and it includes links to the most popular podcast platforms. I'd appreciate a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else supports that sort of thing. If you want to get in touch, ask me questions, or recommend guests, feel free to reach out to ybuttonpodcast@gmail.com, or on Threads or Instagram at ybuttonpodcast, or Mastodon at ybutton@mastodon.social. You can also find me on Threads and Instagram at _Kyle Starr, or on Mastodon at kylestarr@mastodon.social. This episode was produced by AJ Filari. Our theme song was written by Childstar, who's me, featuring my friend Scott Wilkie. It's called On the Same Page. You can find it on all streaming platforms. Thanks again for listening to Y Button, and remember, when you press Y, ask why.